On the night of March 9, 1945, the United States Army Air Forces launched a concentrated incendiary raid against Tokyo that changed the cityscape and civilian experience in a single operation. The attacker was B-29 Bomber Command operating B-29 Superfortress aircraft, staged from the Mariana Islands under the operational direction of Major General Curtis LeMay. The objective was the densely built working-class districts of eastern Tokyo, where small workshops and household industries were interwoven with residential streets. This episode requires a precise technical and contextual framing. Which combination of doctrine, platform munitions, and urban vulnerability produced destruction on an unprecedented scale, which limits on Japanese civil defense transportation and fuel supply amplified the damage? Answering these questions requires tying mission records, meteorological observations, and urban morphology to survivor testimony and post-war survey data. Chronology is straightforward. By early 1945, B-29 operations had shifted from high-altitude precision bombing toward deliberate low-altitude area incendiary tactics. Command directives prioritized the use of incendiary submunitions delivered in dense patterns to ignite wooden housing stock. On March 9th, aircraft released thousands of small incendiary bomblets across a prearranged grid focused on the Shitamachi wards and adjacent neighborhoods. Meteorological observations that night recorded light winds and a stable nocturnal layer that favored sustained surface burning. Material and structural conditions in Tokyo made the city especially vulnerable. High housing density, narrow streets, and predominantly wooden construction produced a continuous fuel load across entire blocks. The physics of surface fires under those conditions generated strong updrafts, ember transport, and frequent spot ignitions that rapidly linked isolated blazes into a single expanding conflagration. Local firefighting and emergency services were overwhelmed within hours, and evacuation corridors became congested with displaced civilians. Contemporary administrative records and the United States Strategic Bombing Survey later documented extensive physical destruction, substantial civilian losses, and mass displacement following the raid. Survivor accounts emphasize atmospheric detail, soot, ash, and falling debris that settled over the ruins like black snow. The combination of operational choice, urban vulnerability, and constrained defensive capacity defines the central stakes of this film to explain how doctrinal decisions, technical means, and urban form combined to produce catastrophic urban destruction. By late 1944, the strategic picture in the Pacific had changed in ways that made a major attack on the Japanese home islands both possible and in Allied command calculations necessary. The capture of the Mariana Islands in summer 1944, most notably Saipan, July 1944, and Tinian, August 1944, put heavy bomber bases within direct range of the Japanese archipelago. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress now had operating fields close enough for regular sorties and for the logistics tail that sustained long-range strategic bombing. At the same time, American industrial output and aerial logistics had scaled to provide large numbers of long-range sorties, munitions, and tanker support. The physical possibility of sustained pressure on the Japanese homeland emerged from these operational facts. Chronology of key developments is straightforward. Throughout 1944 and into early 1945, B-29 groups staged from the Marianas and mounted missions against Japanese targets. Initial doctrine favored high-altitude daylight precision attacks aimed at industrial nodes. Those missions repeatedly encountered two technical obstacles. First, the newly recognized high-altitude wind system over Japan, the jet stream, produced unexpected drift and gross errors in bomb placement when employing high-altitude visual or radar bombing. Second, the decentralized nature of Japanese war production meant that many war-relevant processes were embedded in small workshops and household industries dispersed through residential districts. High-altitude attacks could not reliably neutralize this distributed industrial capacity. Operational assessments and mission reports compiled by bomber command staffs made this inadequacy plain. Doctrinal and organizational shifts followed from these practical assessments. A debate at the command level weighed precision versus area methods. British experience over Europe with area incendiary raids informed some thinking, but the Pacific theater posed different technical and political constraints. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay took on direct responsibility for the B-29 Bomber Command operations against the home islands and initiated a doctrinal change. LeMay and his staff concluded that area incendiary attacks delivered at low altitude at night would better produce conflagration in the predominantly wooden Japanese cities and would produce a higher disruption-to-effort ratio than continued high-altitude bombing. The change was not merely tactical, it was logistical and material. Implementation required different ordnance training, revised ingress and egress profiles, and adjustments to navigation and command control practices. Material developments paralleled doctrinal change. The incendiary submunition M69 and related cluster dispensers were developed and trialed specifically to ignite surface fires over broad urban areas. The M69 was relatively small, light, and designed to burst on impact or after brief delay, scattering incendiary filler that would readily ignite wooden roof tiles and paper interiors. Stockpiling these munitions and integrating them into B-29 load plans required coordination between ordnance production units, the XAK-1 Bomber Command, and forward airfields in the Marianas. Maintenance depots, fuel pipelines, and sortie generation rates all had to be synchronized so that large concentrated attacks could be launched within a narrow window of favorable meteorological conditions. Meteorology itself became an operational factor. Planners sought nights with light surface winds and temperature inversions that would confine smoke and maintain surface flame continuity rather than dispersing ignition points. Meteorological forecasting improved during 1944-1945 and provided commanders with probabilistic windows for effective incendiary employment. The intersection of a favorable forecast forward-based bomber strength and available incendiary stocks created days on which commanders could execute concentrated area attacks with high confidence that they would coalesce into major urban fires. Intelligence and target selection fed into the build-up. Allied photo reconnaissance and signals intercepts indicated that many war-relevant activities in Japanese cities were embedded in residential quarters, small workshops, machine shops, and cottage industries that supplied component parts or repaired critical equipment. Analysts emphasized that destroying these working-class districts would disproportionately degrade war sustainment while also inflicting social dislocation likely to strain national resilience. For planners, the Shitamachi wards and adjacent working-class neighborhoods of Tokyo presented precisely that intersection of industrial relevance, population density, and combustible urban fabric. Japanese defensive constraints amplified vulnerability. By early 1945, Japan faced acute shortages of fuel transportation bottlenecks and a civil defense system that had been taxed by earlier raids. Firefighting equipment in many municipal districts was limited. Water mains had been damaged in earlier air attacks, and labor shortages reduced the capacity for organized firefighting. Evacuation plans existed in principle but were difficult to execute under sudden intensive attack, and with transport networks fragmented. In short, the material baseline of urban defensibility was degraded by cumulative wartime strain. Logistics on the American side completed the picture. The Marianas provided runway capacity, fuel, and repair facilities adequate for repeated B-29 cycles. Sortie generation rates rose with crew experience and maintenance throughput. Ordnance supply chains delivered thousands of incendiary bomblets and associated dispensers to forward depots. Training flights practiced low-altitude ingress and nighttime formation keeping, while navigation improvements reduced the margin of error for target runs. Command directives reallocated sorties to maximize area saturation on selected nights, rather than continuing dispersed precision attacks. Finally, there was a political and strategic frame that made such attacks acceptable at the highest levels of Allied planning. By early 1945, American leadership sought measures that could accelerate the collapse of Japanese military resistance, short of a full-scale invasion of the home islands. The combination of forward bomber basing, doctrinal revision, ordnance availability, favorable meteorology, and Japanese defensive weakness produced both the opportunity and the command-level imperative to employ area incendiary methods. That imperative translated into orders to prepare for concentrated low-altitude night raids directed at densely built industrial residential districts. The build-up to March 9, 1945, thus was not a single decision made in isolation. It was the cumulative result of territorial gains, logistics, industrial production, doctrinal assessment, meteorological forecasting, ordnance, development, intelligence, about dispersed war production, and an operational calculus aimed at maximizing strategic effect. These intersecting causes and the sequence by which they matured set the stage for an attack that commanders believed would inflict decisive material pressure on Japan. What followed on the night itself would test each of those assumptions in the crucible of urban fire dynamics and human response. On the night of 9th of March 1945, the opening moves of Operation Meetinghouse unfolded according to a timetable that synchronized island airfields, bomber groups, and forward ordnance depots. Launch windows began from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian in late afternoon and extended into evening to permit assembly routing and night ingress. The force committed was measured in the hundreds. Roughly 325 B-29 Superfortresses were dispatched, with approximately 279 reaching the Tokyo target area. The load plan prioritized incendiary munitions. The raid delivered on the order of 1,665 tons of incendiary ordnance into the metropolitan target area. Crew briefings at the forward bases emphasized three empirical lessons derived from earlier operations. High-altitude precision bombing over Japan had repeatedly suffered systematic error because of strong high-altitude winds and the dispersed nature of Japanese industry. Many war-relevant processes were distributed in small workshops and household-scale facilities embedded inside residential districts. Command assessment concluded that a low-altitude nocturnal profile using dense incendiary patterns would produce a greater area effect per sortie than continued high-altitude effort. Those assessments shaped tactical orders and the specific loading sequence for each B-29. Operational preparation required precise coordination of navigation formation, keeping, and ordnance delivery. Flight plans issued to group leaders contained waypoints over the Pacific and prescribed ingress corridors intended to avoid known concentrations of radar and anti-aircraft coverage while preserving timing for massed bomb release. Crews trained for nighttime formation operations and practiced deployment of cluster dispensers that released groups of small incendiary bomblets across a prearranged grid. Bomber captains were instructed to maintain lower release altitudes than in earlier high-altitude runs to ensure pattern cohesion and to reduce wind drift of submunitions. The principal incendiary used in the opening phase was the M69 bomblet. The M69 weighed roughly 6 pounds, measured several inches across, and carried a jellied fuel filler designed to ignite on impact or after a short delay. In cluster use, M69s were dispersed by finned racks that opened at predetermined altitudes so dozens of bomblets would fall across a single target cell. The design intention was to create numerous localized ignitions across compact urban blocks so that individual fires would coalesce rapidly. Ordnance planners stockpiled these munitions and integrated them into B-29 load plans while ensuring aircraft stability and range to the target. Meteorological conditions over Tokyo that night were a critical operational variable. Forecasts indicated light surface winds, a nocturnal inversion layer, and minimal high-altitude disturbance conditions likely to favor sustained surface combustion rather than rapid dispersal of smoke and heat. Command meteorologists therefore identified a window in which rising columns of heated air would be confined enough for the conflagration to intensify locally while not dispersing ignition points too widely. That forecast calculus was a direct input into the decision to mount a concentrated night incendiary raid rather than a dispersed daytime campaign. Timing and sequencing over the target were executed to established grid logic. Bombing began with Pathfinder aircraft that placed visual markers and proceeded through staggered release zones arranged to produce overlapping patterns. Each B-29 carried cluster racks that opened to scatter M69 bomblets. The bomblets impacted roofs, streets, and alleys and ignited on contact or shortly thereafter. Within minutes, localized ignitions multiplied. Observers in the air and on the ground later reported that the initial array of small fires quickly became spatially continuous as wind-driven propagation and ember transport bridged gaps between burning structures. Tokyo's urban morphology amplified the intended effect. Large tracts of the Shitamachi and adjacent wards consisted of dense wooden housing with narrow lanes and closely spaced eaves. Rooflines and combustible street-front construction produced what engineers describe as a continuous fuel ladder across entire blocks. Paper interior walls stored household goods and small workshops increased available surface fuel loads. The configuration of streets and alleyways facilitated rapid lateral flame spread when spot fires generated convective updrafts and transported burning embers over intervening distances. In short, the built environment allowed dozens of isolated fires to merge into a much larger conflagration in a timescale measured in hours rather than days. Air defense opposition and attrition during the opening phase were uneven and limited in their effect. Japanese fighter strength over the capital had been eroded by prior campaigns and fuel constraints, while anti-aircraft batteries provided localized resistance. Some B-29s were lost to defensive action, mechanical failure, or fire-driven updrafts that affected aircraft handling. Reports indicate a number of aircraft were lost or damaged in the operation. For the attacking formation, the rate of loss did not prevent mission accomplishment, though it remained a planning consideration for subsequent raids. U.S. commanders assessed the risk as acceptable relative to the expected material and psychological payoff. The visual sequence over Tokyo combined technical precision with chaotic outcomes on the ground. From the air crews described columns of rising flame and a landscape of scattered ignition points that intensified rapidly. Ground accounts emphasized sudden darkness, punctuated by an orange sky and thick smoke accompanied by falling ash and burning debris. Fire brigades and emergency crews confronted multiple simultaneous blazes across neighborhoods. Water supply lines and pump capacity were quickly overwhelmed. The speed at which separate fires linked together exceeded available firefighting response and overwhelmed municipal contingency plans. Tactically, the opening moves achieved the operational objectives set by XC-1 Bomber Command. The low-altitude night incendiary profile succeeded in generating an expanding conflagration across targeted wards and produced immediate degradation of the city's near-term production and repair capacity embedded in household workshops. The mission produced the mass destruction planners sought. At the same time, execution revealed second-order effects that staff planners had anticipated only in part. Fire-driven updrafts and localized weather anomalies altered smoke columns and created microclimatic feedbacks that intensified burning beyond plotted expectations. These physical feedbacks converted a deliberately orchestrated pattern of small ignitions into a larger emergent phenomenon, a rapidly expanding urban fire complex whose dynamics would define the remainder of the raid and its human cost. By the closing hours of the operation, hundreds of acres that had contained dense residential and small-scale industrial activity were active burning zones or smoldering ruins. Routes of evacuation were compromised, and municipal command nodes were forced to prioritize immediate rescue and containment, rather than organized continuity of essential services. From the operational viewpoint, the opening moves had converted doctrinal theory into mass destruction. From the civilian viewpoint, they had converted a single night into a human emergency of unprecedented scale. The subsequent section will examine the decisive moments that transformed these opening actions into the raid's full catastrophic effect. Late on the 9th of March 1945, the raid reached a moment when discrete tactical acts became a single strategic event. The turning point was not a single order, but an emergent interaction among ordnance design, aircraft release patterns, urban fuel continuity, and meteorological feedbacks. In operational language, the decisive action occurred when separate ignition points across the Shitamachi wards and adjacent neighborhoods generated a self-sustaining fire complex with internal dynamics that outpaced all civil defenses and emergency responses. This threshold transformed mission tactics into a systemic urban catastrophe that unfolded within hours. The command decision set the conditions. Higher command had directed low-altitude night incendiary operations with explicit instructions to saturate selected working-class districts. Bomber group leaders executed those orders, and crews maintained their release profiles. Release altitudes were low enough to limit wind drift. Cluster dispensers opened to scatter M69 bomblets across target cells. In isolation, each sortie intended localized destruction. In aggregate, the pattern of successive sorties layered ignition points across adjacent cells and thus raised local ignition density to a critically connected level later described in after-action reports. Material design contributed directly to the decisive phase. The M69 bomblet was engineered to ignite easily on impact and to produce persistent surface burning. In dense patterns, M69s created ignition densities that exceeded a critical threshold for lateral fire spread. These engineering observations were not abstract. They described measurable changes in flame front velocity, ember lofting height, and radiant heat flux that compounded as fires merged. When cluster racks released dozens of bomblets into a compact urban cell, the probability of contiguous surface combustion rose steeply with each additional sortie. Meteorology converted ignition into catastrophe. A nocturnal inversion layer and light surface winds created an environment in which hot gases rising from multiple ignition points could not disperse rapidly. Instead, these gases organized into strong updraft columns. Where columns intensified, they drew in cooler air at low level and produced fire-driven winds exceeding nominal ambient speeds. Those winds forced flame fronts laterally and carried burning embers over streets and rail corridors that might otherwise provide effective separation between burning elements. The result was rapid spot ignition ahead of main fronts and frequent breaches of improvised control lines. The urban form of Tokyo amplified these processes. Narrow streets and continuous wooden roof lines reduced opportunities for effective fire breaks. Paper interior partitions and stored household combustibles provided abundant fine fuels that ignited with low radiant heat thresholds. The urban fabric effectively reduced the physical separation between ignition kernels so that ember transport across narrow alleys commonly caused spot fires ahead of the main fronts. Where block after block contained similar material and arrangement, the fuel ladder was continuous and rapid. Lateral spread became the norm rather than the exception. On the ground, the dynamics were visible and brutal. Firefighters reported concurrent blazes across multiple wards. Pumps and hoses functioned where water supplies remained intact, but many mains had been damaged or were overloaded. The scale of water demand exceeded pump capacity, and firefighting crews frequently encountered low pressure at hydrants within minutes of sustained operations. Fire brigades prioritized sectors and erected temporary control lines, but these lines were repeatedly breached by spot fires carried by embers. Personnel shortages and the loss of key equipment through earlier raids further limited response capacity. Evacuation corridors became gridlocked with evacuees and emergency vehicles creating additional impediments to rescue and suppression. Command and control frictions contributed to the turning point. Municipal command nodes faced incomplete situational awareness. Radio traffic described fires in different sectors but lacked a common operational picture of the scale and speed at which separate blazes were fusing. Delays in dispatching reserve units occurred as leaders sought confirmation of priority sectors and water availability. In several documented instances, municipal requests for military assistance could not be filled promptly due to shortages of transportable fuel and available rolling stock. The absence of a unified incident map and of rapid interagency liaison meant resource allocation was reactive rather than preemptive. Losses among aircraft and crews during the attack were not decisive in themselves, but they formed part of the operational calculus. A number of B-29s sustained damage from anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, or weather-related effects induced by the fires themselves. Crews reported intense updrafts and turbulence over the target area that complicated station keeping and release accuracy for late-arriving aircraft. Command accepted these risks within the mission parameters. The operational objective of mass area effect remained the overriding priority. A second decisive mechanism was infrastructure collapse. Electrical substations and power lines in affected neighborhoods failed under heat stress and falling debris. Pumping stations that relied on electric power or on vulnerable mechanical systems ceased functioning in multiple sectors. Where pumping failed, hydrant pressure fell and firefighting capacity collapsed. Transportation nodes, including tramlines and motorcoach routes, were interrupted as rails warped and bridges were compromised. The cascading failures accelerated. In some districts, secondary explosions occurred where fuel stores or small industrial stocks ignited. Key medical facilities located near damaged sectors reported loss of electricity and backup systems overwhelmed by sustained demand. Civilian behavior affected the unfolding event in predictable ways. Large-scale evacuation in limited time produced congestion that reduced mobility. Households attempted to rescue possessions and to assist neighbors, delaying departure from vulnerable sites. Some residents sought refuge in rivers, canals, and open spaces, which provided limited protection from radiant heat and falling debris, but exposed people to secondary risks including hypothermia and ash inhalation at night. Families moving on foot were often trapped when blast debris blocked narrow alleys. Others who moved toward open spaces were exposed to flying embers and to rapid shifts in wind direction caused by fire-driven winds. The multiplicity of survival choices increased risk for many. The interplay of these factors produced a spatially extensive phenomenon, often described by contemporaries as a firestorm. To be precise, a firestorm is a fire so intense that it creates its own local wind system, drawing air inward from surrounding areas and producing sustained high velocities. On this night in Tokyo, there is evidence that localized firestorms developed within sectors where ignition density, infrastructure failure, and meteorological conditions combined. Those localized firestorms, in turn, merged into larger burning corridors in which pressure differentials and intense radiant heat made interior sheltering and traditional firefighting measures ineffective. Moreover, localized firestorms generated pressure differentials capable of shattering windows and drawing oxygen that intensified internal building combustion. Decision points within command structures also affected the event's trajectory. Tactical commanders on the bombing side faced immediate choices about pattern density and target prioritization. Once released patterns could not be materially altered, the decision to continue successive waves over adjacent cells had cumulative effects. On the defensive side, municipal and military leaders made choices about where to direct scarce resources. The aggregation of those choices, doctrinally driven saturation attacks, and defensive triage produced a path-dependent outcome that favored conflagration expansion. The human consequences of the decisive phase were stark. Casualties occurred both directly from flame and indirectly from smoke inhalation, trampling, and infrastructure collapse. Hospitals overwhelmed by burn victims and respiratory trauma faced shortages of staff and supplies. Mortality concentrated among those unable to evacuate quickly, the elderly, the infirm, and families in tightly packed housing. Field hospitals operated beyond capacity, with limited anesthesia, limited sterilization, and scarce intravenous fluids. Burn fatalities rose sharply as dressing changes and wound care became impossible at scale. The scale of displacement created immediate humanitarian needs, including shelter food, medical care and sanitation, and disease prevention. Large numbers of displaced persons lived in improvised shelters where water, food, and medical supplies were limited, producing secondary humanitarian crises endured beyond the initial conflagration. Strategically, the decisive action produced effects beyond immediate destruction of productive capacity. It accelerated political deliberations within the Japanese government about the sustainability of continued resistance. The visibility of urban destruction and the scale of civilian suffering eroded public confidence in the state's ability to provide protection. Military leaders confronted the stark reality that home territory was increasingly vulnerable to sustained strategic attack. While not a singular cause of capitulation, the raid added weight to the cumulative pressure on decision-makers and shaped discussions about reconstruction priorities and post-war recovery. Command communications on both sides displayed systemic vulnerabilities that shaped the decisive outcome. For attacking formations, the timing of successive waves mattered. A late-arriving group releasing over an already burning sector increased local ignition density and deepened the heat flux. For defenders, the absence of a unified incident command with real-time mapping meant resource allocation became reactive. Requests for military assistance were delayed by routing through multiple civil agencies, which slowed the arrival of relief convoys. Ordnance sequencing further amplified outcomes. Cluster dispensers released dozens of M69 bomblets per rack, so a handful of tightly timed sorties could saturate adjoining cells. When multiple aircraft sequenced across adjacent patterns, the cumulative bomblet density passed a connectivity threshold. That connectivity allowed flames and embers to traverse formerly safe separations and to form continuous burning corridors. Engineers later likened the process to percolation, where isolated ignition kernels could link under sufficient density and produce system-wide propagation. Medical response suffered collapse in affected districts. Field hospitals operated beyond capacity, with limited anesthesia, limited sterilization, and scarce intravenous fluids. Burn fatalities rose sharply as dressing changes and wound care became impossible at scale. Displaced populations crowded makeshift shelters, lacking adequate sanitation, water, and food supplies, producing secondary humanitarian crises endured beyond the initial conflagration. Finally, it is essential to separate observed fact from contested attribution. The existence of intense urban conflagration and its immediate human toll is well attested. The interpretation of proportional responsibility, the ethical evaluation, and the degree to which alternate tactics could have achieved similar military effects without comparable civilian cost remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. For operational analysis, the decisive action on the night of 9th of March 1945 is best understood as the point at which tactical sequencing, ordnance density, urban form, and atmospheric conditions combined to create a self-sustaining destructive phenomenon whose human and material consequences were catastrophic. The immediate aftermath of the raid on Tokyo on 9th of March 1945 produced human and material effects of unprecedented scale in a modern city. Within hours, large urban districts lay burning or smoldering, and municipal emergency services were unable to restore basic functions. Official surveys and municipal records recorded tens of thousands of fatalities, widespread injuries, and mass displacement. The destruction of housing infrastructure and small workshop capacity left large numbers of civilians without shelter or income and required emergency coordination on a scale the city had not experienced previously. Physical damage was extensive. Whole neighborhoods composed predominantly of wooden houses were reduced to charred rubble or burned-out shells. Water mains and pumping stations failed in multiple sectors as fire damaged electrical and mechanical systems. Road networks were obstructed by debris and impassable in many places. Hospitals and clinics near affected wards were overwhelmed and in some cases suffered damage that limited their intake and surgical capacity. The scale of destruction produced immediate secondary risks, including contamination of water supplies and interruption of food distribution. Human casualties were severe and included both direct and indirect mortality. Direct deaths resulted from flame exposure, blunt trauma, and thermal injury. Indirect deaths resulted from smoke inhalation, secondary infection, and the breakdown of medical care and sanitation. Many survivors suffered severe burns, respiratory damage, and long-term trauma. Families lost documentation, property, and livelihoods. The displacement of hundreds of thousands of people created shortages of shelter space and forced improvised communal living that increased exposure to disease and nutritional stress. The social fabric of Tokyo was altered. Neighborhood networks that had provided mutual aid and informal shelter during earlier raids were disrupted by mass displacement and the scale of need. Community leaders and local relief committees attempted rapid coordination, but faced scarce resources and fragmented communications. Social disorder in some sectors followed the immediate catastrophe, as food and medical scarcity produced competition for limited supplies. At the same time, neighbor-to-neighbor support persisted in many districts, and emergency volunteer networks improvised shelters and basic relief distribution. Economic consequences were tangible and immediate. Small-scale manufacturing, repair workshops, and artisanal production located within residential districts were destroyed along with inventories and tools. The loss of these dispersed nodes of production reduced the capacity for local repair and supply distribution. Municipal and national authorities faced the dual burden of emergency relief and longer-term reconstruction planning, even as wartime logistics and raw material shortages constrained rebuilding. Transportation interruptions and damage to small ports and rail spurs further slowed the movement of relief and materials. Administrative response encountered limits. Civil defense and fire authorities attempted coordinated suppression and rescue, but lacked a unified operational picture of the fused blazes. Requests for military assistance were made through multiple channels and were constrained by competing demands on fuel rolling stock and personnel elsewhere. The breakdown of power and water systems degraded command communications and slowed the allocation of scarce resources. Relief convoys that did arrive faced logistical obstacles, including blocked roads, limited fuel, and the need to prioritize sectors with highest immediate survivability. Public policy and political impact were consequential. The visible destruction of the capital intensified debates within the Japanese government and among senior military leaders regarding the sustainability of continued resistance. Civilian morale and confidence in the state's ability to protect the population were undermined in ways that entered deliberations about national endurance. While not the sole factor, these raids contributed to cumulative pressure on policymakers that reshaped strategic calculations and accelerated discussions about alternatives to continued large-scale conventional resistance. Internationally, the raid influenced Allied strategic discourse. U.S. planners cited the operational effectiveness of area incendiary attacks against a wooden urban fabric when assessing options for further pressure short of a land invasion. Post-war evaluations debated effectiveness, humanitarian cost, and long-term consequences for strategic bombing doctrine. The tension between measured military utility and the scale of civilian suffering became a central element of post-war ethical, legal, and doctrinal discussion and informed later treaty and normative debates. Humanitarian needs persisted beyond the immediate emergency phase. Shelter, food, clean water, sanitation, and medical care remained scarce for months in many neighborhoods. Displacement produced secondary public health risks, including communicable disease and malnutrition among vulnerable populations. Reconstruction of housing and utilities was slow in the absence of sufficient building materials, labor, and transport capacity. The reconstruction phase extended into the post-war period and shaped early recovery priorities in the national rebuilding effort. Cultural memory and commemoration began to take shape even as relief efforts continued. Survivor testimony, municipal commemorations, and local memorial practices preserved the memory of the night and of individual loss. The image of ash and falling debris described by contemporaries entered public memory and became a recurrent motif in literature, visual arts, and later historical narratives. Debates over proportionality, necessity, and accountability continued in academic literature and public discourse. The immediate aftermath thus combined an urgent humanitarian crisis, material devastation, and a long-term contest over how the event would be integrated into collective memory and policy reform. Estimates of displacement ran into the hundreds of thousands, with many families housed in improvised camps and public buildings. Reconstruction required sustained national effort and diverted resources from military uses. The scale of rebuilding shaped post-war urban planning debates and influenced decisions about fireproofing, zoning, and housing policy in the subsequent decade. Tokyo, March 1945, occupies a contested place in military and moral history. Operationally, the raid showed how platform range, ordnance design, and staging combined to produce strategic effects against an urban target. The B-29 Superfortress, the Marianas basing, and the M69 incendiary created an operational capability that, under favorable meteorological conditions, could inflict rapid and extensive damage on a wooden urban fabric. Analysts emphasizing effectiveness note that the raid degraded Tokyo's capacity to support certain wartime functions in the weeks after the attack. Ethical and legal assessment complicates any efficiency argument. The raid targeted densely populated civilian districts with munitions optimized for area ignition. Questions about proportionality, necessity, and distinction remain central to scholarship and public debate. These concerns shaped post-war discussions on aerial bombardment and contributed to later efforts to refine norms of conduct in armed conflict. Technical success does not erase human cost. Two scholarly conclusions are broadly accepted. First, the raid produced substantial destruction, displacement, and immediate disruption to urban production. Second, precise casualty accounting and the degree to which incendiary raids alone hastened Japanese surrender remain disputed. These points shape how historians assign operational value relative to humanitarian cost. Key debates continue over casualty estimates, counterfactual targeting choices, and ethical evaluation. Some argue that more precise attacks on clearly identified military targets could have reduced civilian harm. Others counter that the dispersal of war-relevant activity into residential quarters limited the practicality of precision bombing with 1945 technology. Differences in archival selection, interpretation of municipal records, and in how to weigh survivor testimony further drive divergent assessments. Institutionally, the raid influenced military doctrine and civil defense practice. Planners incorporated lessons about urban vulnerability, firestorm mechanics, ember transport, and the logistical burden of sustained area operations. Post-war urban policy in Japan and elsewhere emphasized fireproof construction, zoning standards, and redundant emergency water systems to reduce similar risks. Engineering and operational studies drawn from mission records informed later research into flame propagation and resilient urban utilities. Cultural memory preserved the event through survivor testimony, municipal memorials, literature, and visual arts. The image of falling ash, described as black snow, became a persistent motif in commemoration. Memory practices influenced public debates about accountability, reconciliation, and the ethics of strategic bombing through subsequent decades. One-sentence summary: the night of the black snow demonstrated both the operational potency of area incendiary warfare and its severe humanitarian cost, and therefore remains a central case for assessing 20th-century aerial strategy and ethical limits. Consult archival mission reports, municipal tallies, and survivor collections for detailed figures and first-person accounts. Further notes are in packet. Outro: see the reading list and fact-check table in the production packet for primary documents, mission logs, and balanced secondary studies. Subscribe for further episodes that examine technical mechanics and human narratives behind major aerial campaigns.